So, welcome. Now we are into Module 2 of Chapter 1 for your Lifespan Development class. And where we left off, we defined what development was, and we talked a little bit about the cultural differences regarding age grade, age norm, and social clocks. So, what we're going to look at this module is the historical view of development, how it's kind of evolved into our current state. And then we're going to talk and discuss about the lifespan perspective and the 7 assumptions here put forward by Baltus, and helps inform why your book is designed the way that it is. So let's go ahead and move on here and talk about some of the historical views. So for the longest time, all the way through the kind of the dark ages, way back in the 1100s, 1200s, children were really viewed as mini adults with the same expectations, and that they frankly were just to be treated as such, like adults, and the same expectations should be made. You can even see this a little bit if you ever look at European paintings of royalty of children who are really about like 5 years old, dressed up in all the finery that one would expect in an adult. And in reality, there's no way they wanted to keep that on because it looks very hot and itchy, and they want to run around in as much freedom as possible. And so we began to see a change as people began to go and explore in more detail kind of the historical trend of what is childhood, because childhood, they began to appreciate, is really just kind of a unique period of life, and that the importance of things like parenting, the greater needs for rights and protections of children, as opposed to other ages, were really needed. And so people finally began to study a little more in earnest about what it is about children. And the first efforts to really look at how children change over time, which everybody knew happened, but didn't do it in really a scientific manner. So the man here, where we see baby biographies, is Charles Darwin. You probably have heard of Charles Darwin, and especially The Origin of Species being his most famous, but he was one of the most famous scientists of the day. And he went ahead and wrote a baby biography, which is basically, he wrote about his own children and their development over time. Now, he was not the only one to do this, and they were fine for what we would call anecdotal reporting, or reporting that's just kind of what I see based on my own kind of what I'm witnessing. Of course, the problem is, if you've ever met most parents believe their child is the utmost, most special child in the world. And I certainly hope most parents believe that. But the reality is, most of those children are average. That's the definition of average, right? Most children are going to be able to do what most other children are going to be able to do at the same age. And so the problem with baby biographies is they were based on an N, or a population of one, and that one is the child of the author. So you can see all of the conflicts of interest and the bias that might be introduced when you're reading a baby biography. Once again, it had to be started somewhere, but it's not an objective way to measure these developments. So Charles Darwin was the one that was best known for his baby biography, but there were many other people at the time. And you can see this is almost in the 1900s. So as far as child development, we're not talking about a long span of time. We're talking roughly 150 years here, where we've really intensely been studying children and their development. And let me tell you, it is not a static field. It is constantly changing. They're finding more and more out about the capabilities. Actually, Netflix has a whole documentary on babies, just started season 2. And they are really interesting. If you're interested in babies and baby development and you have Netflix, I highly recommend watching the baby documentaries. So, as I was saying, baby biographies were adequate, but a bit naive and not really objective. And so along came a man named G. Stanley Hall. So that's him below there. And G. Stanley Hall wanted to look in a more scientific way at child development. And so he sent out questionnaires on a large variety of topics, even on when do children start playing with dolls as playthings, when do they stop, How do they treat them? Do they name them? And this seems somewhat inconsequential at this point, but at the beginning, this was big, big questions. It's also a way to kind of develop a norm of when we would expect certain behaviors to occur. So G. Stanley Hall, about 15 years after Darwin produced his baby biography, went ahead and started his questionnaires. They were not our modern day questionnaires. They were not nearly as scientific. There were biases in the ways that populations were sampled, but it was better than what Darwin did. So the importance here when we talk about the science of development is, are things improving? Are they getting better and better over time? Not do they come out perfect the very first time someone comes up with the idea, which of course is not going to happen. Okay, so the questionnaires, and then we went on from there with much more scientific kind of research, which one of your assignments later this semester will be on, in that you need to go ahead and think about the way that we do some of our developmental research. Now, there are a couple of big areas of debate in development, but none bigger than the issue of something called nature-nurture. So nature and nurture, or maturation and learning, are the two kind of tugging forces back and forth on the development of a particular skill. And so maturation was the stuff that I was talking about in Module 1 in regards to aging. When somebody is aging, we're talking about maturation, where your wonderful DNA code starts to send out messages at particular times for particular amounts of development, like time for your chest to develop so that you can go ahead and support pushing yourself up, time for you to be able to understand abstract concepts. That's all kind of maturational. Now, the maturation, though, is not adequate by itself. If you just took a child and you chucked them, fed them, but had no interaction with other people, they would not be as developed as others who were. And so learning is where we want to go ahead, and that's the environment. It's a relatively permanent change in your thinking based on your environmental experiences. So even right now, if you're watching this video, you are engaging in learning and creating relatively permanent changes in your brain, the way that you process things over time. It's the whole point of education. It's why you're in college right now, is for the learning. And the learning can enhance the maturation. And so when you have the two together, then you can really achieve a lot. Now, of course, as far as individuals of intervening, if we wanted to intervene and really help a child out, the only thing we can really impact is learning. We can't really do anything about the maturation and the biology behind it. But always remember the nature nurture. It's going to come up time and time again throughout this semester and in this course about the importance of nature nurture, or maturation and learning. Okay. I should say, and I got a little ahead of myself, but when going back to G. Stanley Hall and his questionnaires, that's not the only thing that he did. He was actually considered the founder of developmental psychology. And he's probably not the best known of the various theorists out there. Piaget, who we'll be talking about in the next chapter and in chapter 7, certainly much better known and associated with development, but it had to start somewhere. And G. Stanley Hall was the founder of developmental psychology. He also founded a little organization called the American Psychological Association, which is the largest association of psychologists in the country even today. So busy man, and quite well known, one that you would really want to know. Okay. One other little thing. I know all the sorts of abstract little trivia about G. Stanley Hall, but he also created the idea, or coined the term, adolescence to reflect the teenage years, and deviated that as a distinct life period. Talk about your grade age norm expectations. And he also stated that it was a time of storm and stress. And so many of you have heard, like, oh, adolescents, they're supposed to be rebellious and stuff. That concept came from G. Stanley Hall. So questionnaires for development of individuals did that. Father or founder of developmental psychology did that. coining of the term of adolescence as a life period, did that. And then finally, that storm and stress theory. So lots going on when we talk about good old G. Stanley Hall. Okay, so the last little part of this module, we're going to talk about Paul Baltus, and that's him in the upper right-hand corner. And there are key assumptions of modern lifespan, okay, the key assumptions. And so this is, there's 7 listed in your book. I had a little trouble fitting them all into one slide, so I kind of overlapped some of them. But it's an important one to think about before we go on for the rest of the semester in our other chapters. The first idea is that development is a lifelong process and it is multi-directional. So lifelong, of course, we are continuing to develop. Our brains are getting more experience, but at the same time, they are also degrading from a maturational biological sense. So multi-directional means that there are gains and losses and that things are coming at us from a variety of avenues. So some is physical, some is mental, some social. Okay. Development is always going to involve gains and losses, and that we are or have lifelong plasticity. So plasticity just refers to our capacity to change in response to various things in our environment. Now, those can be positive or negative. And so it doesn't matter how old you get, you're still going to be able to learn, and it still can change you and change your development. It's shaped by its historical and cultural context. In other words, the era that we live in influences the way that we develop. And so you can think about, especially for women, look at the different ways of the expectations that we have for girls turning into women and what we expect of them, how they're supposed to behave. It wasn't too long ago, if you went back 120 years, women were not expected to work. They were not expected to go into higher education or have jobs that required heavy levels of thinking. They were supposed to stay home and they were supposed to raise their children and maybe teach, maybe be nurses. And so they were not encouraged to go to college. I mean, my grandmother, who was very bright, went to, quote, business school, except business school for women back in the 1920s meant that you went to school to learn how to be a secretary and work for as an administrative type of assistant. And that was the most that they could expect to do. Obviously, we've changed much for the better in our society, and now women are the majority of college students and also the majority of our graduate students. And so the opportunities availed to them and the level of thinking that they are capable of doing has increased manyfold because of the experiences they're now allowed to have. We are multiply influenced. So there's a lot of things in our environment that can influence our overall development, and of course, maturationally too. You can have the best environment in the world, but if you have maturationally inherited genes that are going to make you have intellectual disabilities, the environment is not going to help you that much. And then finally, understanding development really requires a lot of different disciplines. Currently, we're in the psychology department. I have a bias for more of the psychological development of things. I by no means will claim expertise in the physical development of individuals. I'm going to leave that some for the medical field and the way that, say, drugs impact them. And physical therapists would also have a better idea about understanding development from a physical perspective. So there's a lot of these kind of disciplines that have a developmental course, and it's because each aspect really lends itself to a better understanding of the whole picture. I've been doing this for well over 2 decades and looking at development, and I can tell you I'm continually still learning and figuring out how it all goes together. Makes it very exciting. Shouldn't make you intimidated, by the way. Everybody's got to start somewhere, and even a little bit of this knowledge can really help you out. Even if you're not going in to be a developmental psychologist, most of us are going to be parents, or we're going to have to look after children at some point in our life or in our job. And it's really good to have a background in knowing why they're behaving the way they are. And it can make you not get maybe as frustrated when you're having to deal with some of them. So that's going to wrap up Module 2. We're going to go ahead and start Chapter 2 next. But I want you to really be happy that I'm happy that you are in this class. I think it is a wonderful topic, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So keep an eye out for these modules. Make sure to kind of watch them all the way through, and I think it'll really help you in your performance in the class. Take care.